Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to see so many people filing in. As you file in to the webinar today, we would love to find out who you are, where you might be dialing in from, and what interested you in this topic today. Are you a mental health care provider? Are you an advocate? Or are you just somebody wanting to be more educated and more involved? Please let us know. You can use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to do that. And we're going to give people a few extra minutes to file in, and then we will get started today. Yeah, we've already got some answers coming in. Thank you so much to everybody who's here.
Yeah, it's exciting to see where everyone's coming from.
hmm And you all can keep putting that information in the chat if you'd like, but I'll go ahead and issue our formal welcome to NAMI at noon today. My name is Amy Brundle. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications at NAMI North Carolina, and we're super pleased to have everyone here for today's webinar. First of all, as always, we give our special shout out to the North Carolina Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Use Services for their support of today's webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping items. If you have any questions for our speaker today while we're going along, please put them in the Q&A section or the chat section down below, and we'll answer them probably towards the end as we have time, but we may do kind of a mid-session breakdown of some questions. It just depends on the flow. Also, we'll be sending out an email by the end of the week with a link to the recording and extra resources that our speaker has provided for us. And now, speaking of her, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Emily Barnhardt. Emily is a licensed clinical social worker and the Bridging Families Institute consultant at Crossnor Communities for Children, where she takes a lead role in the statewide expansion of Crossnor's innovative professional foster parenting program. In this role, Emily supports Crossnor's effort to change how families experience the foster care system across North Carolina, partnering with child welfare agencies to elevate trauma-informed and family-centered practice and improve family reunification outcomes. She has a BA in sociology from UNC Charlotte and a Master of Social Work from UNC Chapel Hill. Her early social work career began in human trafficking response and survivor advocacy. During her time as a therapist, she's worked with survivors of sexual violence, domestic violence, and human trafficking, and led a multidisciplinary team in Mecklenburg County focused on improving system-level response to sexual assault. Across her various roles, Emily has continued working with human trafficking at the survivor-facing, organizational, and community levels. We also want to give a huge thanks to the Collaborative Health Network for their support of today's webinar. Crossnor Communities for Children is a trusted partner within the Collaborative Health Network, which is a statewide clinically integrated network dedicated to advancing whole person care. Emily proudly represents Crossnor as part of CHN's Speaker Bureau, where she amplifies provider voices, shares critical expertise, and showcases the impactful work being done across the network. Her commitment to collaboration and advocacy helps strengthen awareness and drive meaningful conversations on issues that matter, including today's focus on human trafficking. So, welcome, Emily. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you all so much for being here today. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join this really important conversation. I want to give a couple notes here before we get started. First, I want to start by clarifying that because of time, today's session is going to be still pretty high level. It's not really going to be going deep into clinical interventions, treatment models, or really doing a deep dive on any of the topics that we'll touch on. We can certainly come back to some of those things in Q&A. But the focus of this is really understanding human trafficking as trauma, how that trauma can show up in mental health, in behavior, and in the healing process. We'll spend just enough time on 101 information and really to ground us in shared understanding. And then we'll spend the rest of our time, excuse me, talking about mental health impacts. Um, I know that this is a very mixed audience, so I will try to use plain language as much as possible and focus on that shared understanding rather than technical expertise. This topic is really heavy, and the content that we'll be talking about can be difficult to listen to. So I want to really emphasize self-care and um, tell everyone to please feel full permission to practice self-care during this, whatever that looks like for you. If you need to step away, exit the call. It's an important conversation, but it is very heavy. So take care of yourselves. And then finally, before we start, I I just want to be fully transparent that because this is such a complicated, complex topic, some of the deeper layers and nuances around the impact of this trauma that we'll touch on, I find are not talked about very often in training on human trafficking, probably for several reasons. One of which I imagine is how easily this information could be used to generalize, stereotype, and just really apply one size fits all understandings to survivors. So I really want to ask, I felt the weight of responsibility in preparing for this and really want to emphasize that we all need to hold this information carefully and be intentional and cautious not to generalize this to every survivor because every survivor is different, and to make sure that we're also not looking at survivors solely through the lens of their trauma because they are not their trauma. I do think having this conversation is important, though, because I've seen how harm and re traumatization can happen when providers don't really understand the, the ways that trauma can show up.
Hmm, absolutely. Thank you again for being here and for lending us your expertise. Of course, there's only so much we can do in an hour, but we'll do our best. So we want to just kind of start off with a framework question. Can you explain as briefly as possible in this format what human trafficking actually is and who may be most vulnerable to it?
Yeah, it's a huge question. So I'm going to summarize best I can. Under federal law, human trafficking involves the use of three things: force, fraud, or coercion to compel someone into labor or commercial sex. There are two primary forms of human trafficking that you hear about most often, and that's labor trafficking, which is someone being made to work for little or no pay, and sex trafficking, which is being pressured or forced to perform sexual acts for someone else's profit. And both sex and labor trafficking occur throughout the United States every day. It's important to also clarify here that minors cannot legally consent to sex acts. So, whenever a minor is involved in commercial sex, it is considered sex trafficking under the law. And that is regardless of whether force, fraud, or coercion is present. Another quick clarification that's a common misconception is that trafficking does not equal smuggling. Trafficking is about exploitation and control, which we will talk a lot about. It's not about movement. So while smuggling can sometimes be a part of a trafficking situation, that movement across borders and even across cities is not required. Many people are actually trafficked in the same town, even in the same home where they already live. Then, when we look at who is most vulnerable, while anyone can experience trafficking, traffickers exploit vulnerabilities and typically rely on grooming and manipulation to pull someone into trafficking, not kidnapping. And I really want to slow down for a moment here because this is still where a lot of people imagine something really dramatic and obvious happening, when in reality, recruitment, which is a term that we use for that process of a trafficker targeting and luring someone in, recruitment often looks like meeting a need. Traffickers are very skilled at identifying vulnerabilities and targeting people with vulnerabilities of some kind, people who experience certain social and systemic risk factors, such as housing insecurity, economic instability, addiction, mental health challenges, prior history of abuse and neglect, unstable home lives, immigration status, or simply just a lack of support systems. Now, we know that some of the most disproportionately affected groups include women and children, women and girls, children and adolescents, especially those involved in foster care and juvenile justice systems, LGBTQ plus individuals, people of color, and people with disabilities. And then when we add in any one or combination of the vulnerabilities that we already touched on, prior abuse, homelessness, financial insecurity, lack of support, that risk of exploitation just continues to increase the more vulnerabilities that someone has. Once a trafficker has identified a vulnerability, they will connect with and develop a level of trust with that individual through a process called grooming. And this process often involves the trafficker offering to meet a need, like I said before, making false promises of love, of safety, stability, employment, housing, protection. And sometimes those offers are real at first. The trafficker might initially meet that need for someone, but then what happens is that the conditions will shift and expectations will change, control increases, and that person's options, choice, and autonomy will quickly disappear.
Mm.
Traffickers will often frequent settings and places where they're more likely to come across people that are experiencing these types of vulnerabilities. So that can be shelters, bus stations, rehab centers, schools. And what we are seeing consistently more and more of is that traffickers are increasingly targeting people online and trafficking online, especially youth. Traffickers are increasingly using online platforms such as social media, gaming, dating apps, really any platform that allows for live communication. So when you get the resource, we'll provide a resource guide later, and there's a section there for online safety resources as well. And then the last piece we can talk about broadly with trafficking is looking at North Carolina specifically. So I have a couple slides that Amy can pull up for you, and I won't go into any of this data, but this is data from identified cases in North Carolina in 2024. And for the sake of time, I won't touch on it, but Amy can, you can show those two slides
Mhm.
while I'm continuing. When we look at North Carolina, our state consistently ranks among the top 10 states nationally for reported human trafficking cases. What I want to emphasize here is that when we talk about North Carolina ranking high in reported cases, it's important to be careful with our interpretation of that because reported cases don't directly reflect true prevalence, if that makes sense. It reflects higher reporting that's happening. So our high ranking is due to high reporting, and at the same time, North Carolina does have specific, well-documented factors that make it a hotspot for trafficking. And some of those factors include our interstate infrastructure. So we have multiple large highway systems that intersect in large cities that make it very easy for traffickers to move around and transport victims. Our agricultural and service industries that have high demand for temporary low wage labor, which can be exploited. And then our tourism in large metro areas where we have a lot of high volume, high traffic events, and all of those increased demand for temporary labor, commercial sex, which traffickers will exploit and can often more easily operate within and around undetected in those high traffic, high volume environments. Um, so we can hold both of those things as true, that our high ranking reflects that North Carolina is a prime target for traffickers for several reasons, and our state has increased awareness and reporting and detection efforts, and that is also part of that ranking that we hear so often.
Mhm.
And we also know that trafficking is widely underreported, so reported numbers will only ever tell us part of the story.
Yeah. You touched on this a little bit, but I'd love for us to get a little bit deeper into some of the misconceptions that people may have about human trafficking. Either they've seen TV, movies, or yeah, something like that. What are some other myths that you'd like to bust about human
Yeah,
trafficking?
question. I think one of the most common misconceptions is one that we've already touched on that I'll just reiterate because it is one of the most common, and it's that sensationalized cinematic portrayal of trafficking as stranger abduction. You know, someone being snatched off the streets, being kidnapped, like the movie Taken. Every time I talk about trafficking, I usually start by asking how many people have seen that movie because most people have. Um, and the reality is that trafficking most often does not look like that.
Mm.
It involves grooming, manipulation, and coercive control within existing relationships. Most victims are trafficked by someone that they know to some degree, and that can include family members, romantic partners, trusted adults, coaches, employers, caregivers. It can be anyone. A second common misconception is that trafficking always involves physical violence and physical captivity, and it doesn't. It can, but in my professional experience, that has not been the case with most of the survivors I've worked with. Control over a victim, I'll continue saying statements like this over and over because it is so important to understand that control over a victim is maintained through psychological coercion, manipulation, threats, isolation, creating a sense of dependence on the trafficker. The the last misconception I'll name is the misconception that only women, girls, and children are trafficked, when, as we discussed, it's really about vulnerabilities. So, men, trans, non binary people are also trafficked. And it is really important to know that they are under identified and underrepresented in our statistics and across our services. And I wish I could talk about all the misconceptions, but what I will say is that clarifying all the misconceptions, understanding the truth about human trafficking is so important because they shape who we believe and who we don't. When trafficking doesn't look like what we expect, that's when survivors are often not identified. They're dismissed, misunderstood, and easily fall through the cracks in our systems. I think
Yeah.
that,
Yeah, that's a huge point, especially as we get to talking about our next topic. Really wanting to make sure that we understand this, so many more people than we imagine could be impacted by something like this. Um, so getting into the mental health impact of this kind of trauma, what are some of the mental health implications for people living in trafficking or otherwise unsafe conditions?
before getting into specifics, let's first zoom out and look at the trauma of human trafficking a little more broadly because we need to understand it as a form of chronic, complex, and interpersonal trauma. And due to it involving ongoing coercion, betrayal, and a loss of autonomy over time, it often creates a sense of psychological captivity, like feeling trapped, a sense that leaving is not an option, not possible, not safe.
Mhm.
Because of those dynamics over time, survivors often show complex trauma patterns rather than the single trauma event PTSD that we might be more familiar with. Though there are some similarities, and Amy can pull up a slide where I've listed some of those out just as a visual aid for you as we talk through it briefly. So, for example, across studies, one of the most commonly reported mental health impacts includes PTSD and PTSD symptoms. So things like recurring memories or nightmares, avoidance of reminders of the trafficking, hypervigilance, feelings of detachment, dissociation, and emotional numbing. Symptoms of clinical depression and anxiety are also very common, as well as a wide range of somatic symptoms. Somatic means of related to the body. So that can be sleep disruption, gastrointestinal issues, chronic tension and pain, fatigue, headaches, any any other physical symptoms that are not caused by an underlying medical condition. And then substance use. Traffickers will often use drugs and alcohol to control a victim being trafficked, which can keep them, disoriented, compliant, and reliant on the trafficker for continued supply to avoid withdrawal. And that over time can frequently lead to dependency. So then, after exiting a trafficking situation, that continued substance misuse or addiction can make it really, really hard for survivors to access the services that they need to find and maintain employment and really just ultimately to rebuild their lives. We also see thoughts of suicide and suicide attempts a lot. That's very common. And before continuing, I want to pause here and say that this is by no means an exhaustive list. Survivors can also frequently experience eating disorders, self-harm, personality disorders, OCD, more and more. Because traffickers target vulnerabilities, struggling with mental illness can increase someone's risk for victimization. So we can also see a wide range of mental health challenges in survivors because some of those may have been present before the trafficking also. Um, Beyond diagnosable mental illness, this what I really want to talk about is that this type of trauma can have can have really profound long-term effects on a survivor's self-worth, relationships, and general ability to function in day-to-day life. Because human trafficking is an inherently relational crime, it's also relational trauma. And that relational trauma can deeply and profoundly affect someone's ability to trust and connect with other people. For many survivors, especially those who are trafficked by someone close to them, like a family member, which happens very often, the trauma isn't just what happened, it's also who it happened with. And that can result in really deep attachment wounds and difficulty feeling safe in relationship. And what that struggle can look like, how that can show up, is anything from aggression to complete avoidance or fear of connection and relationship, people pleasing, or repeating, unintentionally repeating patterns of past abusive relationships. I'm hoping, as you hear this, I'm hoping that you can imagine how that level of fear and difficulty around trust, connection, and relationship can have really profound implications for therapy, for healthcare, for survivor support services, for friendships, really for any relationship or well-intentioned support. Because the real challenge there is that the very thing that is needed to heal relational trauma, which is safe, secure, healthy relationship, can also feel like the most dangerous and the scariest thing to a survivor. So these relational impacts can and often also worsen mental health challenges and mental health symptoms. And all of that combined can really disrupt and hinder the access to care that is needed and deserved. And that's why understanding trauma informed care and trauma informed support, which we'll continue talking about, is so essential for anyone working with or supporting survivors of trafficking. Because the reality is that your relationship or your interaction with the survivor may be the first safe connection that they experience following what they've been through. And I'll be, bold in saying that you have the mandate as providers and the opportunity as supporters to avoid causing further harm and to provide a new, safe, healthy experience of connection for them where it was previously extremely harmful and damaging. And in therapy, we call those corrective experiences, understanding that, trauma that happens in the context of relationship is best healed in the context of safe, secure relationship.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, obviously, this is so much more complex, even for people who are trying to provide help and support to our survivors. What are some other unique considerations around human trafficking regarding relationships, like you were just talking about, mental health conditions, or how survivors might resent when they're trying to begin treatment or therapy to unpack some of this?
Yeah, it's it's so hard to answer this question in an all-inclusive way, which we've already talked about in going into this webinar in general. So in addition to what I've already shared, I think there's a couple topics that come to mind that feel important to mention that are unique considerations with this population. And the first is trauma bonding. So there's a term, trauma bonding, that is well documented in interpersonal violence literature, and it's especially important to understand when talking about human trafficking. Trauma bonds or trauma bonding, you'll hear both, refer to strong emotional attachment that is formed under the condition of fear, dependence, isolation, and intermittent kindness. And it helps explain why leaving a trafficking situation can be incredibly complex, as is true for other situations of interpersonal violence as well, and why a survivor returning to a trafficking situation can also happen again, like in other interpersonal violence situations. So some survivors may maintain contact with or return to traffickers, and that is something that is often deeply misunderstood and often leads people to blame the survivor and lose empathy when they don't have an understanding of what is really happening in that situation. So I think that's important to mention and to make sure that we're clarifying that trauma bonding is not a sign that someone wants to be harmed. It is a predictable response to coercive control over time. And it's also not uncommon for survivors to blame themselves for their exploitation because of trauma bonding or because of false manipulative narratives that a trafficker might repeat over and um, over a period of time about their worth as a person, them deserving what was happening, and so on, with negative messaging that can be repeated in a trafficking situation. And so it can take a very long time for a survivor to really recover a sense of inner worth again after enduring that recurring harmful messaging.
Mm.
And then a second thing is another unique consideration with this population is understanding that many survivor behaviors, trauma responses, are routinely misinterpreted as noncompliance and resistance, especially in healthcare, mental health, and social service systems. And those trauma responses can show up differently. And we've already talked about some, but specifically to these systems, that can look like distrust of providers or institutions, missed appointments, disengagement, flat affect or emotional shutdown. It can look like anger, defensiveness, suspicion, accusation, or just general attempts to control situations because there isn't a sense of control with them. These responses can often make a survivor come across as combative, and I've seen that easily lead providers to assume that a survivor is disengaged and uninterested in services, and that's one moment that they can start falling through the cracks. So we need to be very intentional in separating a survivor, the human being in front of us, from those trauma responses. Because when survivors get written off quickly and fall through the cracks, they don't access the services that they need and deserve. The trauma responses that you might witness in someone are not indicative of who they are as a person, and that simple truth is something that is should always be at the forefront of our mind. And those moments when this kind of confusion and a survivor showing up in certain ways, and a provider might have a lot of feelings around that. These are the moments that I would ask providers and supporters on the call, this relates to you too, to pause, step back, and ask yourself, what would it mean to treat this behavior and look at this behavior as information rather than defiance?
Mm,
What might this person be protecting themselves from right now? Like what might feel threatening to them in this situation right now? Because if I can maybe try to identify that, I can try to find ways to increase a sense of safety for them or open conversation about it. Because what gets labeled as resistance is really a person's nervous system doing exactly what helped them stay alive. Scanning for danger, responding to perceived threat, and protecting themselves in ways that were learned over time. These responses become a really deeply embedded survival skill. So it's also really important not to push a survivor to abandon these behaviors too quickly, because that can be actually really incredibly destabilizing for someone. Because that way of being has historically helped them survive and been a shield to try to protect themselves from further harm.
mm,
And then I think the last thing I'll say here is sometimes sometimes survivors also present in ways that can feel really confusing and honestly sometimes a little alarming to providers. And like they might seem really highly disorganized, disconnected from reality, or display symptoms that resemble psychosis or personality disorder. And research and practice consistently cautions us here, because the truth is that trauma, dissociation, substance use, sleep deprivation, and ongoing threat, whether that threat is real or perceived, all of those things can mimic severe mental illness. And we too often see survivors being prematurely diagnosed with severe mental illness based on how they're presenting. And once a survivor receives a stigmatizing diagnosis, that label will follow them across systems, impacting housing access, credibility, how they're treated, and even safety planning. So, caution around diagnosis is not just a clinical issue, it's an equity and access issue. And that is a
mm.
key takeaway today for any mental health providers present.
Yeah, that's an excellent note, and exactly why we do programs like this, to give providers some of this nuanced background information. Um, what additional challenges could providers face when they're specifically working with trafficking survivors?
Um, there, there are a lot. I think there's a lot that we could talk about here, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it simply because there are a lot of educational resources already out there that are very specific to different sectors. And so I would really encourage providers to seek out further learning that's related to their field, because there's likely tailored training and resources available for you. But a few points that I'll make quickly are: there are unique considerations and challenges related to trafficking around identification, so identifying a survivor, barriers to accessing and sustaining care, and the impact on providers themselves. So with identification, if I had to say one thing about this, I would say no, the disclosure may not happen early on, if at all. And just because a survivor hasn't disclosed doesn't mean that what you're doing isn't working, that care isn't working, look for the indicators and trust that, and don't take an approach of trying to interrogate. For barriers to accessing and sustaining care, survivors will often face significant barriers with housing instability, transportation, safety concerns, legal issues, and fear of systems like law enforcement, immigration, and child welfare. So, care frequently requires multidisciplinary coordination, which can be difficult given certain service gaps, especially for minors, men, foreign born survivors, and survivors with complex health needs or severe mental illness. And then with the impact on providers, working with this population really does affect providers. And so understanding and knowing about vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress is really, really crucial, because those experiences are very common, especially when systems are unable to meet a survivor's needs and we feel like our hands are tied, or we want to help and we're trying to figure out how. And just the experience of holding stories of what people have experienced can be really heavy over time. There's a lot of resources out there on vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress as well, and that will also be included on the resource guide. So please seek that out if you do work with this population and that's not something you're familiar with already.
Um, and so kind of broadening our audience who we're talking to. We've been talking to providers about some specific challenges they may face. Getting a little bit broader, what are some do's, don'ts, other considerations that not only providers, but family, advocates, other supporters should kind of know about so that they are the most effective supporters that they can be?
I would love for everyone to walk away from this conversation really reflecting on how they show up as as a human, as a person, as a supporter. Knowing that healing is unique to each person and that safety, choice, and autonomy are central in that healing process. So, support should always be restoring control and not replacing one form of control with another. And if we list out some things that helps, I have a slide that we can pull up that you're welcome to grab a screen capture of if you would like. Um, So, what helps? These are a few of many points that could be made here, but ones that I felt were most important to talk about. Prioritizing physical and emotional safety. So, that awareness of how environments, people, or systems might feel threatening to someone and adapting accordingly. Being trauma informed, which, if you've never heard that term before, what we mean when we say trauma informed, the very definition of that is understanding how trauma affects someone and approaching situations and interactions with them based on that knowledge you have of how trauma could affect someone. So, in being trauma informed, that would look like with a human trafficking survivor understanding those trauma responses and how psychological, behavioral, and somatic responses can present for survivors, so that we can recognize that. And when we recognize that, we can help ground and center safety rather than escalating a situation by not realizing what's happening. Empowerment and choice matter. So that can look like offering options, centering a survivor's voice wherever and however you can, shared decision making, building trust, um, and transparency and predictability build trust. This was one of the very first things I think I learned when I started working with trafficking survivors. Do what you say you'll do, and don't make promises that you can't keep. And of course, things happen, and we're not perfect. So we can't always guarantee that we can do what we say we'll do, but be very mindful and cautious with that, because transparency and predictability, reliability really goes a long way in building trust. And when we're not practicing that, it can very quickly lose trust, cause someone to lose trust in us.
Mm.
Offering practical support, I think might be on the next slide. Um, Offering practical support if you're in the position to, housing, food, transportation, financial assistance, those things that often determine whether healing is possible. This is where communities can really come in to support sometimes, and we've seen that be really effective and helpful when there's that community support around a survivor. Cultural humility and system awareness are really important. What we need to understand how identity and history can shape experiences of harm and care. And we need to know what we don't know and do the work of learning so that we can be more informed in how we're working with survivors who have identities that we don't and that we don't understand their lived experience with our systems.
Mm.
And finally, relational self-awareness, which that word really just means being aware of what I said earlier, how you show up in a relationship, of your own characteristics and traits. In working with trafficking survivors, relational ruptures, conflict will happen. And those relational repairs can be so important for healing, but it requires us to be curious, to have empathy, to be patient, and to have respect for people's boundaries if repair is not something they're interested in. So the takeaway here in talking about what helps is really trauma informed support. It actually looks really unremarkable. And what I mean by that is it's the little things like slowing down. It's explaining why you're asking a question, explaining in detail the roadmap of exactly what a survivor can expect with services or care. That's especially important for healthcare professionals. Um, like we've talked about, noticing the cues that someone might feel threatened in a situation and leaning on everything we've talked about today to find ways to increase a sense of safety for them. It can be as small as looking at your office space or a room that you're in if you're, family, community member, supporter, and choosing not to sit between a survivor and the door, especially when you
Mm.
don't know them well. And that's something that you might not even notice, but for someone who might feel unsafe, they are going to notice if you are blocking their exit. So that's what I mean when I say that it often looks really unremarkable. And when you learn to approach things from a trauma informed lens, it really becomes second nature and will become automatic. It also looks like letting someone say, not today, or I don't want that, and honoring that. So think of being trauma informed as things that don't have to be really dramatic, big gestures. They are the little everyday moment decisions that you make to prioritize safety and um, really promote someone's choice and power. And those little moments can be very, very deeply healing and corrective over time.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
oh, I just realized I didn't touch on the don'ts. Well, I will say, of course, stating the obvious, what the don'ts are and what harms is really the opposite of what is helpful. Um, and we've already touched on that a lot, so I won't go into that more. But a few other general don'ts I can mention would be, you know, be very cautious and don't ever force someone to disclose, that they have experienced trafficking or the details of what they've experienced. There's a mindset, like a rescuing mindset, that can really be problematic. And we urge people to try to reframe that because with that rescuing mindset can often come with a belief or a mindset that you can just love or hug a survivor back to healing and life. And, while hugs and love are certainly part of the healing process when it's welcomed and when there's consent, for that kind of healthy physical touch, it's not a very realistic way to look at healing from this type of trauma. So pay attention to that mindset of if there's this mindset of rescuing a survivor there. And another don't would be, don't ever try to confront a trafficker unless that's actually your job to do that. And be very cautious not to, um, just to honor someone's confidentiality and don't share details of someone's story without their explicit consent and permission and engagement with that process.
Mm.
And last, I'd say pay attention to the way that power and control dynamics come up in your work with survivors. Do your best to open up conversation when those relationship ruptures happen, and try to make effort to resolve that. And just know that even well-intentioned actions can cause harm if those actions are removing someone's autonomy or unintentionally mirroring patterns of past exploitation. So just be aware of that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great note. I mean, I think that, without some of this training and education, um, people wanting to be supportive could accidentally be exacerbating the harm. So it's important for everyone to seek out, if you're interested in being an active supporter, an advocate, in treating survivors, that you seek out additional education like this, but also like some of the resources that we have to share with you all. Um, is there anything else that you would like to add before we get into some viewer questions?
Um, I think with the resource guide, I'll just share that um, the resource guide will have some national and North Carolina specific resources. And I tried my best to categorize links based on the diverse audience members here. So hopefully it's easy for you all to find a starting point for what you might be interested in. What I personally want to highlight about the resource guide is that there's a section at the end specifically listing a few survivor led networks and peer connection opportunities. And the reason I want to highlight this is because in all of the human trafficking training I've attended over the years, which has been a lot, it has always surprised me how few mention long term support and community connection resources for survivors. And any of us who have experienced something in our lives and benefited from connecting from someone who's also experienced that can understand how supportive that can be. Sometimes, not all the time. Um, I just think it's really important for survivors to know that they aren't alone and to have ways to connect with one another if that is wanted and supportive for them. So, for any community members that are part, if there's any members from faith communities here that have resources at a church or providers that work in clinics or offices, if you are handing out resource guides, I would really encourage you to include resources for how survivors can connect to each other. And that can be through local nonprofits that offer support groups, that can be through larger ones, but I just think that we should be including that more than we are. And I think that's it. So thank you all for being part of this conversation, and I'm happy to open it up to questions. I can't promise to know all the answers, but I will be honest with you if I don't know and can try to find out, or I'll tell you what I can.
Your comment about support groups actually answers a question that we received about support for families or loved ones of people in these situations. And yeah, I can't speak for other groups, but NAMI North Carolina does have family support groups for the family members and loved ones of people who are experiencing mental health conditions. And I think that this is, so uh, connected to that could potentially serve a similar purpose. But whether you're looking for one of our family support groups or possibly a different kind of support group that might fit this sort of niche
Mhm.
audience, I'm going to put our helpline in the chat for everybody. Please feel free to contact us. We can help you find some of those resources very readily. And then, of course, you'll have the resource guide that we'll be sending out by the end of the week. But I wanted to get into some audience questions first.
Yeah, and can I also say about that?
Hmm.
Think I might have mentioned this on the resource guide, but with support groups, depending on where you live, I would look up nonprofits that are human trafficking focused in your area and also connect with sexual and domestic violence nonprofits to
Hmm.
see what kind of support groups they have available and share interest in that kind of group because it might be that they don't have one, but that they might have enough people interested in starting one.
Absolutely. Um, so one question we have is, are you familiar with a term called gang stalking?
I have heard that recently, actually, within the past year, and I'm going to admit that I think I looked it up and I can't remember exactly what it means. Is this a specific question you have, or just a term that you heard and were unsure of? Would be my follow-up question.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that they didn't give any additional context, but if you ask that question, you want to put some additional context in the chat. Oh, specific.
Yeah, I think if I'm recalling correctly, it's talking about a different recruitment method that's been or a new term for a recruitment method that's been identified. But I don't feel like I have enough information to speak specifically on that. But
Okay.
I'll have to look into that more.
Hmm. And then we have a question about labor trafficking. Does this include someone grooming and giving false promises of giving their business and then having them work and not pay for it when they did not receive the control they wanted? Have you heard of a situation like that being referred to as labor trafficking?
Yeah, can you read it one more time?
Yeah. So can labor trafficking include someone grooming and giving false promises of giving them their business, then having them work and not pay them for it when they didn't get the control they wanted?
Yeah, any situation where someone is being forced to work for little to no pay and someone is profiting off of that, that's where we would look at that under the definition of labor trafficking.
Hmm.
And
And then
it's well, I
oh,
was
go
going to
ahead.
say specifics matter. I'm always hesitant to say 100% that something is without hearing the entire situation. But yes, if someone is being forced to work for little to no pay for someone else's profit, that that's the definition of labor trafficking.
If somebody were to find themselves in that sort of position, what are some of the first steps that they could take?
So reaching out for immediate help to safely exit a situation, if someone is currently in one, I'd reach out to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And that is on the resource guide, and we can also provide that number in the chat. I can put that in, or Amy can, before we end. But that would be a good place to start because that national hotline can refer you to services and help you get access to services in the area that you live, and often have relationships with local service providers that can assist with whatever that need is to exit a situation, and then connect you with the local providers who can provide that emergency case management and help figure out what would be most helpful next step.
Hmm. Okay. And then I think that um, this is my own question that I'll ask. Say somebody's not a provider, they're not a clinician, they are not, but they understand that this is a big problem, especially in North Carolina, and they want to try to advocate for better policies, more research, et cetera. How can the average layperson get involved in a way that's actually supportive?
We're looking at like policy response, how we are dealing with trafficking at a system level.
Mm,
I would say find the people who are doing that work in your area and join them. You know, there's a lot we see a lot in the field of human trafficking work of people coming in and kind of reinventing the wheel. And sometimes that's needed. Sometimes that can be challenging when there's multiple people trying to do the same thing. We are always stronger when we're working together. So if that is something you're interested in, look up, coalitions, in if you're interested in, if assuming there could be people here outside of North Carolina, but assuming most people are North Carolina residents, then we have the North Carolina Human Trafficking Coalition, the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission. There's a lot of different groups within our state, especially location specific where you live, that you could get involved with. And I do have a lot of links on the resource guide for North Carolina too. So I always encourage people when you are interested in getting involved to do your own research, because it's important for you to know, what organizations you're most interested in, what types of services, what type of work. Research
Mhm.
the organizations, connect with them, kind of vet them and figure out what the best pathway for you is.
Yeah, I put a couple of examples in the chat for
Mhm.
everybody. The North Carolina Coalition Against Human Trafficking and the Eastern North Carolina Stop Human Trafficking um, group.
Yes, thank you for including NC Stop. That's a
Mhm.
good one too.
Yeah. Um, uh, you know, just anecdotally, they share an office with us in Greenville. So we're
Okay.
we actually work very closely together now. So it'll be great to kind of see what kind of work they're doing in that
Mhm.
community to curb this issue.
Yeah, those would be the first two groups I would connect with. But there are many other resources, so I always want to encourage people to research and see what's out there in their
Mhm.
area.
And we'll provide some assistance on that by giving you all a resource guide that Emily has graciously put together for everybody as part of what we send out. By the end of the week, you'll have a copy of the recording. You'll have that resource guide, and you'll have a feedback survey. We always love to hear what you all thought about the presentation, what else we can do to improve your experience watching a NAMI at noon. Please feel free to fill that out. Um, and I so First of all, I just want to say thank you so much to Emily for giving of her time today. Thank you for this incredibly just, somebody said, great digestible information on an important, complex topic. Could not agree more. You really boiled this down to what people need to know and take away immediately. So we really appreciate you coming on and giving your time today. Um,
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And I want to encourage everybody to keep an eye out on future NAMI at Noon episodes. The next one that we have scheduled is for February 24th, where we're actually going to be talking with a therapist and the executive director of the Carolina Resource Center for Eating Disorders, kind of getting a full one-on-one on eating disorders and how they present and how they can be recovered from as part of Eating Disorders Awareness Week. So you guys won't want to miss that. Keep an eye out for registration information about that. Um, as we wrap up, is there anything else that I can have you leave us with today?
I would also just reiterate that we would love your feedback. As I mentioned earlier, this isn't this type of focus on the mental health impact of trafficking is not something I have personally seen before. So I would love to know how that landed for all of you and ways that I could improve that if I talk about this again. So thank you for filling out the survey in advance.
Well, we want to wish everybody a great afternoon, depending on where you are in the state. Stay safe with additional weather coming, and we hope to see you at the next episode. Thank you all so much.